thank you for your willingness to give our Science Cafe this evening. And as those of you who know Dr. Haller, you know that he is an amazingly talented physician scientist, but he is also a very passionate art historian. So we're really excited to have him join us this evening to talk a bit about a new initiative that he is launching and that we are very proud to put forward this year. And so it's a new initiative that features art, science, and the humanities. And so I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let him tell you more about how MDIBL is going to really highlight these three things. And I think those of you who know the lab know what a great environment it is for that sort of creative spirit. And so those are really some of the things that we want to be able to support and highlight and encourage in our faculty, in our students, and in our staff. And so this is a wonderful way for us to begin to do that. So Dr. Haller, we're excited to learn more about this new initiative, and I will turn the floor over to you. And someone please, dear God, take my picture off the giant screen.
Thank you, Cherry. I think everything's working. We are changed. Well, here we are. MDIBL. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Cherry, for the kind introduction. And we'll talk about imaging the world, the intersection of art, humanities, and science at MDIBL. You know that we have a long history explaining the world. I mean, here is the place where the kidney, where transport was not only discovered, but then explained and communicated to the world. And science has become even more complicated than it was at that time. And it has become more colorful. You can see here three examples of science and art. And I think it's obvious that all of these are fascinating. I mean, perhaps you would like to have this hanging on your wall. It's a single cell analysis. I'm not going to explain, how this works. These different colors are different cells. And there are younger scientists than me who actually understand this right away with a little bit of explanation. They know how to do that. There are more of these colorful diagrams, to be honest, every day out there. We have machines where we can do this here at MDIBL as well. But how to explain that, and it really is fascinating with the different cells. Here in the middle, you have a beautiful example of one of our new initiatives, and this is the mesospim microscope, where you can actually get an understanding of whole animals and make sections through whole animals. And on the one hand, it sounds fascinating and it's very modern. But on the other hand, I can tell you, they already made sections during this time I will talk about. And this seems more like an old-fashioned painting, which in fact it is. But to explain what's going on here, you need art historians. I mean, we all can appreciate the beauty and the aesthetics of all three of these examples, but we need, for better understanding, scientists to explain to us the images of the world. And we are wonderfully suited for that at MDIBL, because when you travel to northeastern Maine, you have a little bit more time to think about things before you talk. At least I try to do this, which is hard. But we look at pictures. This is why we do microscopy here in these analyses. And we try to bring these things together. And we try to confront these different ways how to see the world. We are not the only one. We have stolen this title, branches from the same tree, from the National Academy of Science. And they have used this quotation from Albert Einstein, where he said, These are all branches from the same tree, all these aspirations. And he's talking about religion, art, and science are directed toward ennobling man's life, lifting it from the sphere of mere physical existence and leading the individual toward freedom. These are wonderful sentences, or one wonderful sentence. And at least for the next hour, we'll do exactly that. So we are trying to bring these together. And you know, this has been the goal of National Academy of Science, of other academies over the last years. And here you see these branches from the same tree. This is this publication from the National Academy of Science, where they make it very clear that if we can't do that, if we can't make us understand what's going on in science and what's going on in art, then we will fail. And our first symposium, which will take place in 2 weeks, August 19th and 20th, is on metamorphosis. That's what we do scientifically here. We have axolotl here, and then they undergo metamorphosis. Some of you have been during the summer here in Maine, and you have seen examples of metamorphosis every time you go swimming. Because you have seen these little animals and they became from elongated forms, and now they have 4 legs and they breathe, and this is metamorphosis. And we'll have on the theme of metamorphosis both our researchers talking about the molecular mechanisms of metamorphosis in axolotl, for instance, but also art historians. And I like titles like Fertile Hybrids, Material Transformations and Workshop Secrets, the Regeneration of Grotesque Ornament Across Media in the Renaissance. I mean, that's a lot of titles, and we are looking forward. Then we have Jim Kaufman, who has a very strong interest in work to metamorphosis in the animal development before, but then we have those which have undergone no such alteration, fossils, race, and transformation in 17th century Europe and beyond. So this will be an interesting symposium, and I can tell you, we will let these talks collide with each other. We will all be in the audience, and then we are looking forward to a very interesting discussion. The only thing we told the people we invited, that they have to be understandable. I mean, if the scientists do not understand what the art historians are talking about, and vice versa, then there will be no discussion. So this is what we're trying to do. This will be our first experiment. And Jerry and Emily and Anna, you have been working very hard to make this happen, and we'll see how this goes. And not in preparation of that, but you know that I'm interested in that, and I have some training in that. I'll give you one lecture where I think science and art comes together, and I'll talk about this painting, which is one of the last paintings by Peter Bruegel. Peter Bruegel, a Dutch artist, Flemish artist, lived in the 16th century. The painting is in the museum in Naples. It got to Naples because it was first owned by a duke in Parma, who bought it. It was very expensive already at that time in the Netherlands. And then it came to the Farnese family in Rome. And then from there, it went to Spain. And then when the Spanish king became king of Naples in the 18th century again, it went, and now it's hanging in the Museo di Capodimonte. And it's called The Blind Leading the Blind. And we can see this easily. When you look at this painting aesthetically, you're immediately aware about the dangers of life. Because on the one hand, you have an abyss here. I mean, this is dangerous. I mean, these blind men, I mean, look at that. I mean, they're almost falling down here. They will all be killed. We just wait. And the first one has already stumbled and has been fallen. And the others, this one is almost losing his grip. And the other ones are not in a very good shape. So it's a very unsafe story. And the whole movement of the whole painting is all going down here. There is salvation on the other side. There is firm ground. There's a church there. If they only could see the church. They're well dressed. I mean, they're not beggars. When you look at them, I mean, somebody must have dressed them in the morning. They didn't do this by themselves because they're blind. So the social background of these is a bit more complicated. But the story by itself is on the insecurity of life. It's about the blind leading the blind, which shouldn't happen. I mean, the people who actually can see should lead the blind. And we'll talk about this picture and about the background of this. And I'll try to develop the hypothesis that this is basically a science painting. It's one of the famous paintings, not only by Bruegel, but in art history in general. Most of you may know Peter Bruegel as the painter, not of stories like this, but more like this. Yeah, this is Peter Bruegel. You go to the museum, paints peasants, goes out there, most likely he's sitting somewhere. Wonderful paintings. This one is in Vienna. A lot of his paintings are in Vienna because the Spanish kings were not only kings of Spain, but they were also kings of Vienna, of Austria. So this is why we have so many Bruegels hanging in there. As I told you, about 5 years after he died, none of his paintings was on the market anymore. It was very hard to get one. His sons wanted to buy a painting, and they couldn't get a Bruegel in 1585. So here you see what I've explained before, and you need an art historian to explain what's going on here, what's happening here. It's all about country life. It's all about peasant life. And we have also paintings like this. This is the fight between carnival and land, filled with figures. This will be important at the end of my talk. How long can you sit there or stand in front of this painting and look at that before you're getting bored? Or if you stand there with somebody else who is interested in the painting, I mean, you can have lots of discussions, what's going on here, but you also need an art historian, or at least a historian, to explain a little bit what this all means and how these, what the meaning of the painting is. And we know Peter Bruegel from paintings like this. When I was 16-year-old, this was hanging in my room. I was more interested in pop art at the time, but this painting meant something for me. And this is the first winter painting, or we have paintings like this. This is called The Gloomy Day. This is the same series as the one before about the season. Some of you may think that he was a peasant painter, and in a way he was sitting somewhere in the Netherlands in a small village and painted there. This is not correct. Peter Bruegel was very well trained. I will not go into that, but this is one of his sketches from Rome when he was there. He was for 4 years in Rome, as every or most of the painters in the 16th century did. And this is the Ripa Grande. This is the old harbor of Rome. Wonderful sketch by Bruegel. And then I show you something which may astonish you. As one example, these are typical peasants by Bruegel. Also wonderful sketch. Look at this man here, sitting there, very eccentric. Do you know where he got this figure from? This is Michelangelo. That's the Sistine Chapel. This is a very famous person inside, and these are the same lads. So it clearly tells you that Bruegel was a very learned painter. Even when he painted things like this, there is much more history in there. But let's go back to the painting here. You know that this is from the Bible, from the Gospel of Matthew. The blind leading the blind. I've already talked about churches here, about the abbess here. And I think we are all aware that 1568 in Antwerp, this is where Bruegel painted, was different from here. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of the painting to better understand the painting. This is Antwerp. At that time, the center of the entire international economy. You're aware that 60 years before that, the New World has been discovered. That's the phrase I shouldn't use anymore, but that's how it's described. So there was a lot of exchange, there was a lot of trade, and all the trade of Portugal and a lot of trade from Spain went through Antwerp. The Boers of Antwerp traded most of the money. It was the richest city in Europe at that time. And this is where he painted, but it was not without conflict. It was the time, and you have just seen the abbess and you have seen the church, when there was a war because Reformation was only 40 years old. And in 1566, that's 2 years before Bruegel painted The Blind Leading the Blind, they sacked all the churches in Antwerp and all through the Netherlands and through France and through Spain and through Germany, and they took out all the painting. And they destroyed most of the statues because, as a Protestant, you should not have sacred paintings and you should not adore these strange saints. So you can imagine 2 years later, he paints, and he's a painter, The Blind Leading the Blind before that background. Some of you know the most famous painting in the Netherlands, that's in Ghent, the altar in Ghent, barely survived this. They dismantled it within half an hour and put it in the back room of the church, locked the door and hoped for the best. Then people came in and they burned the whole church, and then only the altar survived. And I will not show you all the examples when you still go to churches in Europe that you see the faces which have been taken off. And here you see some of these examples, you know, when you go into these churches and you see these altars, and a lot of art was destroyed. So being a painter during that time in Antwerp, because it was not the whole city, it was just part of the city. And at the same time, politically, this was like today. Basically, Peter Bruegel was painting in the Ukraine because this is the empire of the Habsburg. Here you see the Netherlands. This is under Charles V. And then you add all of their new colonies. This was the empire where the sun never set. And the Netherlands had declared they want to be independent. We have at least one Dutch person here, and you still have this history. I mean, they fought for 80 years to become independent, and they had just started in 1566. And the Spanish crown sent the Duke of Alva, ruthless, really put the people on the stake, and they were fighting the Dutch. And this is the Battle of Austerweel, 1567. That's about the same year. But that's the Ukraine. This is about 30 miles from Antwerp. So I think this explains some of the background of this painting, apart from its aesthetic qualities, what it actually means to have such a painting and what it means when you look at the time. But then when you look more carefully, all of a sudden it becomes medical. It's a medical painting, isn't it? I mean, it's about the blind. Have you looked carefully, where the blindness comes from? You may not, because I was talking about battle and war and reformation and all these things. When you look more carefully, you see that all of them have different eye disease. And I will go as a medical doctor. Unfortunately, I'm not an ophthalmologist or this, we can't see his eyes. But these eyes, there is removal of the bulbi and the eyelids, so most likely enucleation, blinding as a punishment, which was not that uncommon at the time. So he's a criminal, but it could also be that the Spanish took out his eyes. So we can't be sure whether it's a criminal, but this is the cause of blindness. So this is him. Now he has corneal glaucoma. Very nicely described by Bruegel here. When you look at this is from the textbook. This is dense, wide corneal scars, fibrosis secondary to a previous corneal insult, most frequently trauma or infection, which at the time that happened. You can see the face, you can see the cap, and you can see the eye disease. And the next one has also a different disease. This is shrunken eyes. This is phthisis bulbi. Non-functional shrunken eye results from insult, trauma, or infection. But I think he did a very good job in describing on this painting these different eye diseases. And when we go further, this one with the cap, it's not only that he paints this, but he makes us understanding eye disease, because this is very common. This is photophobia, an eye discomfort in bright light. And you have this, when you have cataract injury, you can have this in diabetes. So he was an observer. And all of a sudden, the question is, whom did he talk to? Could he call his colleague who was doing ophthalmology at the local university? And the last one, this here has pemphigus. Sorry, I went too fast with that. This one has pemphigus of the eye. So that's interesting. But the question is really, why did he do that? Sorry, I mixed up the slide. So this is pemphigus here. You can see here these eyelids and the discoloration. So why did he do that? Were there textbooks? And yes, there were. So when you look at one famous textbook, this is a little bit later from Georg Bartisch, you can see that the textbooks almost look like paintings. So this just supports my hypothesis. It's imaging the world, it's imaging physiology, and it's imaging disease. So he must have had a look at this, so this was possible. To be honest, this is the first book, and it was published 15 years later, so I don't know exactly whether he could look at that. But what I found startling is that he was actually doing different diseases. So the question is, why did he give us here a collection of eye disease and making this almost like a medical textbook? And when you look at his paintings, you find that he was doing these collections all the time. This is also Vienna. This is children's games from 1560. And this has all the known children's games in the Netherlands in 1560 on the painting. This looks colorful. A lot is happening here. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's a collection. It's really taken into account all of them. So he must have done research on that. He must really have collected this. There are books on children's games, but later on then. So he was one of the first collecting children's games, putting these together. I mean, you look more carefully, you can see he did a great job. I mean, disgusting. But here, all sorts of games they were playing. Very careful here, what he described. But there are other levels to it as well. Here, for instance, this is this blue cloak they have, this hood. This is deception. So these children are actually playing games which are happening in the adult world as well. And you'll see this in a moment again. And this part is all about religion. These are children, and here they are tearing the hair out of Jesus Christ, and here they are putting him into his grave. So within these children games, he was also talking or painting about religion. So we have different layers, which makes these paintings even more learned, even more scientific in a way than we see at first glance. So collecting and describing, and that's one of the hypotheses, happens in these paintings, and this is perhaps pre-scientific, but you have to categorize and you have to look carefully. And there are more examples. This is a famous painting which hangs in the gallery in Berlin. This is called The Blue Cloak, also about deception. You can see here the wife putting the blue cloak on the husband, or at least another, a male. But these are Flemish proverbs, all of them. All together, you can spend quite a lot of time. They are looking at these. Some of them we know, some of them we don't. And when you look more carefully, for instance, this one, hitting your head against the wall, I think everybody understands this. Why one shoe and one barefoot? I don't know. This here is this wife and her husband. I let you think about what the proverb is for that in the Netherlands. Perhaps Bernard can help us out there. He even has the blind leading the blind and the background of that. So this is another example of a very learned painter who actually made collecting and describing what he had collected an important part of his work. Was he alone? Did he this do by himself? Was there anybody else interested in that? So who was interested in proverbs at that time, 16th century? Famous people. This is Erasmus of Rotterdam. This is the first edition of what he called Adagia. This is a collection of proverbs, of Greek and Latin proverbs, and 3,000. He was actually so much interested in that he spent 2 years in Venice in the print shop of Aldus Manutius, taking care of the first edition of that. And you're all aware why he was doing that. He was translating the Bible from Greek into Latin, and he was editing lots of other books. But nonetheless, these collection of proverbs, the first edition was in 1504. This is an edition in 1516, where he was also involved in Basel. The last edition, 1536, that's not that far from when he died. He had 4,151 proverbs in his book. Ironically, when you read about this, it's almost forgotten. You know, people put this somewhere on the back burner. I've read books where it says, well, among his not so serious works, he did this proverb stuff. But for him, you have just seen this, and you have seen this about the science somebody like Bruegel put into that this is important, and Erasmus is a famous print by Albrecht Dürer, the same. So I think proverbs in Erasmus' works and here, that this is the same type of how I image the world, how I get a grasp of what's going on in the world, how I collect things and make this understandable. And to be honest, he does almost as good a job as the single cell analysis. One painting, and you have a full understanding of what's going on, and you don't need a book like Erasmus from Rotterdam where you can read all through these proverbs. However, the editing, the commentaries of Erasmus are really very interesting. And this also happened in literature. This is Gargantua and Pantagruel, famous book by François Rabelais, physician and author. I can tell you this makes for tedious reading. You know, this whole list of things, collections of almost everything describing, but that's typical of early Baroque art and literature and typical of the painting. So this painting is then not only about the eye disease, it has not only the aesthetic qualities, it's not only about the political situation and the whole background, it takes place in a cultural setting, which is very important. It has to be understood. And he was not an isolated painter sitting somewhere. He was living in the richest city in Europe at that time. And these are his friends and contemporaries. And I will talk briefly about this whole city where he was working. And one of his best friends was Abraham Ortelius, and he was also describing the world. He was a cartographer. He made these maps, and he was very famous for that. He edited and printed first the first world map ever, and exactly at the same time. And we know that they knew each other because Ortelius had a very nice book for his friends. You know, where his friends could write proverbs or poems and could say, well, it was great to have dinner with you. And this book is still in Cambridge in the library. And Peter Bruegel had his page. And others had the page as well. So the hypothesis is that geography, and this is a painting of geography from Franz Flores, also in Antwerp, also part of the same circle, that this all came together when they discussed understanding the world. They were discussing map making, geometry, and they were discussing paintings as well. Another one, not that famous, Joris Hofnagel, he painted this, insects. He was the first to make still lifes in the Netherlands. But he was not interested in the aesthetic quality of these flowers. He was interested in grasping nature And this is one example of metamorphosis. You can see here butterflies coming out of these moths. So this is also something which happened at that time. And Joris Hofnagel had also his name inscribed in this book of friendship of Ortelius. Dramatic times. 8 years later, the Spanish were not paid their salary, the Spanish soldiers. They sacked Antwerp. They killed 7,000 one weekend, and they took away all the money, for instance, from the Hofnagel family. Ortelius and Hofnagel went together to Frankfurt and then to Munich. So a lot of people were then spread throughout Europe and had to find jobs otherwise. Let me finish up with, you have to make this work. This is Christophe Planton, largest press at that time. The Planton press is still in here as a museum. You can see this here, very influential, published lots of books during that time. And this shows you the atmosphere. This is art meets science. Here is the science and here is the art. And this was not only in the mid of the 16th century, but this is 80 years later. That's actually by Jan Bruegel, a son of Peter, where you can still see then not only the geometry and map making here, but then you have the flowers, you have all these animals, and the examples of collections and how this happened in the 17th century could go on. You also need sponsorship for that. That's one of the richest merchants, Gillis Hoffman, at the time. He actually gave all the money for the publication of the Ortelius world map. In addition to that, he was responsible for the first translation of the Bible into Arabic. And then he sponsored the distribution of this Arabic Bible in Morocco. And last, we have talked such a lot about paintings. Who saw all these paintings? Whom were they made for? Who actually looked at them the way I've tried to make you look at them for the last hour? These paintings were all owned by the same person, Nicolas Jongeling. Nicolas Jongeling was a merchant in Antwerp at the time. He actually made his money, which I find very impressive, by buying old castles outside Antwerp. Then the castles were erased. He rezoned the property and then he sold it for villas. And then he used the money to buy the painting. So this is the Jongeling villa, one parcel, 2 or 3 acres he kept here. And all these paintings were hanging in his living room. So you can easily imagine the crowd I just described to you, Ortelius and others, merchants all mixing there. And because they had no TV, they had to look at these paintings and discuss the different levels of what we have just described. And they mixed art and science. So that's what we want to do. I gave you an introduction into the blind leading the blind. I hope you found this interesting, and I can all invite you to branches from the same tree and our symposium on metamorphosis. Thank you very much for your attention. It's nice to have people in the audience again, not only here. I think Anna will take care of questions from the Zoom, but otherwise questions.
So Herman, that was fascinating. Wonderful presentation. 2 things. One, I assume the painting, the Bruegel painting, which is a marvelous work of art, will not be a metaphor for the Iowa.
So, that's a very good. I mean, the way you put it, it would mean that it's a recommendation. It may be a metaphor, what we are not going to do. But it will not be our strategy.
But more seriously, do you think, given the history you presented, that are we guessing, or do we know that Royal had in this network of friends that he may have had in Antwerp some of those positions? From those positions, would be picked up some of these?
Yes, I've looked into that. Very difficult, because I said this textbook from Bartisch is actually published in Prague and Dresden, so quite a bit from Antwerp. I mean, they were traveling a lot, and it was later. I don't know. The medical tradition in Antwerp, the famous university was in Leiden, the medical school during that time. To be honest, I don't know. I wasn't able to find that. And to be honest, there is only one publication on the eye disease and the Bruegel painting from 1956. Oh, yes. So the question was, who was the ophthalmologist Bruegel asked when he painted the painting? And my answer was, I don't know. Yes.
But there were, say, were texts that were much more graphic in nature, or much more, say, exact. Were there purists at the time? Did you read anything about purists who insisted that making science had to be done more detailed and less expressive?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a complicated question. The question is, which form, I may translate your question, which form do you actually choose? And where there are recommendations, you should use one versus the other. It's a fascinating time. It's when science starts, it's not that people have not collected things or thought about categorizing things in the Middle Ages and long before that, but then it was done in a more comprehensive way. And then it was also nurtured by all these things coming from the Americas. For the first time, they realized, oh my God, there is another world. There are other things which we have not seen before. There are other things which have not been described in some of the books we believe are the essence of our knowledge, like Aristotle. So I think there was more of it. But then your question is about painting versus printing and describing. It was not resolved at that time, because they had this wonderful short proverb, ut pictura poesis, which means paintings should be better than words. But you may think that the ones who wrote the books may think, give me a break, I can do better. This was the time when allegories were first formed, where you had both, where you had a small sketch or a painting, and then you had a poem, and it was on the same page. And lots of literature about who won, who was more descriptive, who was more, and here the painters were using everything. I mean, the colors they used. And this will be one topic in our symposium. Where do you think Bruegel got his colors from? He invented them. He bought them in a shop. In which shop? Some of the painters invented their own colors just to make the point that you can differentiate with different colors, different things. So they were using all the information, and this is my point, in such a painting, to have these different layers and to be as complex as possible in one painting. And this is also what links science to. Yes, please. Yeah.
What you're talking about is Peter Bruegel. He had a son Peter Bruegel the Younger. I wonder if you could give us similarities and differences between them in terms of style, major paintings.
Yeah, I can go back. So there is Peter Bruegel the Younger, and there is Jan Bruegel. I've just shown you one. I think this was Jan Bruegel. So that's also the son. So he had two sons, and they also became painters. First of all, it tells you something about tradition in families. We don't know nothing about the father of Peter Bruegel, the elder, so we don't know whether there was a longer tradition in the family. You can see the difference here. What happened then at the beginning of the 16th century, you had more colors, more details. For them, this is, you know, what the younger Bruegels were famous for, their still lives. I briefly mentioned still lives, that still lives is not, or not only, about the beauty of flowers. It's more about description of nature. And you can, the composition of which flowers are in there and how flowers interact and what the relationship, that's part of the science in these paintings as well. One of the Bruegel sons worked in Rubens, with Rubens. He was working for Rubens, especially for animals. So at 60 years later, when Rubens was working in Antwerp, the organization of painting was a little bit different, that he had specialized painters for specialized subjects.
Dr. Haller, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm just curious, this is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it for you. In your sort of best case scenario, what would be the outcome from the symposium on the 19th and 20th? I mean, what would you like to see the result be of that event?
Well, Terry, that's perhaps it's not an unfair question, but I mean, the worst outcome is that they don't talk to each other and that we don't ask questions, and we just realize between the two branches, there is a huge gap of non-communication. I hope that this will not happen. The best outcome is that we will have an interesting time for 1 day and a half, but you are asking about the strategic outcome of that. I think that we will open with this symposium an area where we have the luxury at MDIBL to define topics which we find interesting in the future to talk about. And it's already happening. This year, we'll talk about metamorphosis, but we already have applications for next year's symposium. And one of the ideas next year is to talk about the genetics of beauty. Mm. And some of you may know that there is a famous Nobel Prize winner, Frau Nüsslein-Vollhardt. She was at the Max Planck in Tübingen. She has written a small book about the genetics of beauty. We have researchers who are actually interested in the genetics of butterfly wings. And this goes very nicely with that these painters sometimes used butterfly wings and put them into their painting, just because they are so much more beautiful than what they could do with them. And actually, when they did this, they were kicked out of the Painters Society because they were using natural objects instead of doing the real thing. So, Jerry, to answer your question, I think that this will be an area which I think suits MDIBL, that with our excellent science, we can bring together these two worlds. And at least for some time during the year, we'll have a basis to have other discussions. And I think that it will also help our understanding of science. When you look at other examples, how you can communicate things, I think this will also help us with science.
Interesting. Thank you. Listen, while I have the microphone, there's a question from from an online participant. It says, in the painting related to the children, in addition to different types of play, are neurodevelopmental conditions displayed? For example, what we would now consider to be autism?
Yes, I think when you look at these children, you are aware how much pathology is in there. I did this on purpose, showed you this one, not very nice game where they used all sorts of crap they had there to play. They are cruel to each other. I mean, tearing the hairs out of one of their friends, or perhaps not friends, is not a nice act. And when you look more closely there, there is a lot of cruelty in there, which at that time happened more. But yes, I think you can find quite a bit of pathology in there.
That's great.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a long hour. Thank you very much for coming.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Haller, so much. And thanks to all of you who are participating online. We're still learning this new sort of hybrid world, but hopefully we're getting a little bit better at it. So thanks for sticking with us. And for those of you that are interested in learning more about our Art and Science Symposium, there is some information on our website. And if you're interested in attending, you can just reach out to me or someone else in the development office. We have sort of a limited seating, but as Dr. Haller mentioned, this is a relatively new initiative for us. So one that we are just doing on a small scale this year, but look forward to expanding that as we go forward. So thank you all again so much for joining us. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a great Science Cafe featuring our graduate students. So some of you may realize that MDIBL just recently formed a formal graduate student program. And we have a wonderful group of international students that are with us throughout the year. So we want to introduce that program to you and tell you a little bit more about our programs.